Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Akhtarzandi, Managing Director of Atlantic Live, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Commerce Squared, the Internet of Everything. IoT, the Internet of Everything. The future of tomorrow is already here. Toasters connect to stoves, and refrigerators place orders for groceries. Any baby cam that connects to the web or smart TV that streams Netflix is a web-enabled consumer internet device. Cars place orders for takeout food from restaurants they know are on your way home. The internet is everywhere, and almost everything will soon be connected to it. Billions of devices are connected, and billions more will be in the next few years. So we're here today to explore the promise and the pitfalls of an internet-connected world. We'll explore the future of the Internet of Things today and look at policy and issues that could enable it to change the world. What challenges do cities and companies face in building digital infrastructure to support new technologies? How will new innovations affect the consumer experience? And what will it take to ensure security and reliability in a vulnerable cyber world? Before we begin, I'd like to thank our underwriter, Visa, for making today's conversation possible. A bit of housekeeping before we begin. Please silence your cell phones, but keep them out to join in the conversation. We're on Twitter at Atlantic Live with the hashtag Atlantic Commerce, all one word. And we also want to hear from you in the room today, so we will take questions throughout the afternoon after the various panels. And now, to dive into our program, we'll hear from two leading members of Congress on this issue. First, please welcome Representative Ryan Costello, a Republican from Pennsylvania who sits on the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. He's here with Steve Clemons, the Atlantic's Washington editor-at-large. Steve, the floor is yours.
Great. Hey, everybody. Great to be with you. Thank you for joining us. I love the trail mix, whoever got that. M&Ms are a very good bait to get me here. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us.
I had a lot of that bait, too. Ben.
Yeah, good. A big day yesterday, right? So how did your crowd do in Pennsylvania?
I'm a Republican.
Yeah.
Democrats did pretty well in the collar counties of Philadelphia. So things are, the political winds out there are shifting a little bit, obviously.
So I just did a big, one of my deep survey dives via Google, of course, into you. And I saw you had co-sponsored legislation with Democrats on sexual harassment. You're part of a group of 10 that said there really is such a thing as climate change and we ought to prepare for it. You're out there on a number of issues. I saw Mark Warner, either you applauding Mark Warner or Mark Warner applauding you on trying to end food deserts. And so you've got all this legislation that you're doing with Democrats, which is not something we hear a lot about. So before we dive into the Internet of Things, I'd love to know how you sort of look at the statutory world of that. Sure. How, are you doing something that is the precursor of a lot more bipartisanship coming, or are you the last person doing it?
I don't think I'm the last person doing it. I think that there are a lot of members of Congress and senators who should get more credit than they do get to work with others. My orientation is always towards governing and trying to solve problems. And my feeling is that if you don't solve a problem with consensus oriented information, the problem's just going to become bigger and it's going to be even more difficult to manage down the line. My frustration is when we don't get things done on a timely basis. But I also think that you have to orient your decision making toward where the facts lead you, and that ideology has a role maybe through which to organize information and evaluate things, but ultimately there has to be practicality to how you go about getting to the finish line. And I think that Congress, look, I'm in a very swingy district with a lot of diversity of opinion. And there are parts of this country that are very, very conservative. There are parts of this country that are very, very liberal. And you have to accept that for what it is and still kind of work within the guardrails to get things done, and I try and do that. And there are other members that do that. I think that we probably have to spend more time speaking about that, because I think most Americans shake their heads and say, oh, that's like, give me more of that.
Right. Well, today we're talking, this is one of the topics I really like, because you're able to sort of project yourself forward and begin saying, when you're talking about a cashless world or an internet of everything or an internet of things, a world in which cities are retrofitted. People, I'm wearing my Fitbit loyally today. I am at 5146. How about you? And when we're all basically connected in a very different way that weren't there. And sometimes I imagine if we were in California or on Mars and we were not in Washington, D.C., what would be some of the questions we'd be asking? But I want to ask you, as we think about these internet of everything, this connectivity that's coming in the future, what do you worry about? If any, we were talking about your 4-month-old.
Yeah.
If your 4-month-old is 15 years old, you go out, 14 years and 8 months. What are the things that you hope we will have achieved in this dynamic world of innovation?
So, well, what do I worry about? It would be more Thoreau or Rousseau, in the sense that I worry that maybe we'll lose sort of what makes us human beings and nature, and like not being too dialed in. Andrew Sullivan just wrote a piece recently about, like, when you're on your phone 8 or 9 hours a day, you're not interacting with your spouse or your children, or you're just like, life is life. And sometimes you can learn a lot when you're bored. But when you're always dialed in, you're always trying to get that fix.
Right.
And I don't think that that's good for the human experience, because kind of how you can form bonds with people and have a common experience in this world is by getting offline. At the same point in time,
I just want to say the Atlantic fully endorses any references to Thoreau. Go ahead.
At the same point in time, there is a tremendous opportunity to create more efficiencies so that we all can live more, right? Like if it's projected that IoT is going to reduce the amount of chores, the number of hours you spend doing chores in your home by 100 hours a year, that's a good thing, right?
Right.
And the same can be said just for battery storage, energy usage, congestion mitigation. I mean, there are a lot of ways to get a lot more out of life by utilizing IoT platforms as a consumer, leisurely, as well as business-to-business applications. So I think it's obviously a balance, and I think it's important that you don't veer too far in one direction, because you could lose sight of the other side of the coin.
Do you worry about the regulatory, the statutory side of this? Do you think that, given what we've seen with Equifax, given what we've learned that you can hack into a car today, or even in some pretty interesting criminal cases that are coming forward, no matter where you're at, we'll be able to kind of solve some criminal cases today by tracking where the Fitbit was in a house. But it's raising these interesting questions about privacy. Sure. And about whether we're ready for that. Do you think about that from a regulatory perspective?
I do. And on the privacy side, I think we're never going to get it right simply through a statute. I do believe that this is going to be a scenario where, look, the innovation side of this is going to be in front of anything we can do in terms of codifying privacy regulations. I think some of it is going to be cultural. What do we accept as a society? More than anything else. At the same point in time, when you're talking about the security side of privacy and the Equifax breach, really that should have never happened. Equifax received the software in order to get rid of the malware, and then they didn't do it. So that should have been avoided. At the same point in time, my bigger concern, I'm less concerned about an entirely new technology creating a platform, and now you're doing something that you could never do before,
right,
using IoT applications. But when you're talking about legacy systems, and then you're tacking on top of that, right, or stacking on top of that, that's to me where some more privacy implications come about, and where perhaps I hate to say statutory, it's probably more regulatory, because I don't think Congress is ever going to really get it right. You're much better dealing with the FDA, right, or DOE on something IoT, look at all these acronyms coming out of my mouth, on something IoT related than Congress passing a piece of legislation that will somehow magically, comprehensively address all the sophistication of what and complexity of what may happen in a technology platform.
As you and your, because you remember the Internet of Things Caucus with
Yes.
Darrell Issa and others. So I guess I sense, and we have Anna Eshoo coming up here, that there is a growing tension between those who worry about public interest being sacrificed in the name of technological advancement, and that there are lines being divided. And I wouldn't even say they're Democrat versus Republican, but there are some that worry that you can get in the way too early
Sure.
of advancement versus others. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that you're onto something, and yes, and it's a balance that I think everybody identifies with. I would say that I think a lighter touch regulation is what's needed, and here's why. Engineers have a much deeper appreciation, not for what only exists now, but for how things are going to be 5 and 10 and 20 years from now. And to have policymakers kind of predict that is going to end up probably being more of a barrier or an impediment, because technologies can solve problems quicker than we can regulate our way to solving a problem. So my sense is to have innovation lead the way. And I would say that on IoT, I would say that on clean energy, even if you look in the healthcare space, I mean, look, what you can do with a gadget that then can get connected to your physician, that then can get connected to an insurance, like if we think that government is going to be able to regulate that space in such a manner that we're going to make it more efficient than technology would be able to make it, I think that that's a fool's errand.
If not you, who's the smartest technologist in Congress? In the House?
Darrell Issa, I would think.
Really?
Amongst Republicans, I think Will Hurd has an exceptional background. I'm sure that there are some Democratic members as well that I don't know as well. I would say my colleague, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, who's up next, who I don't know too well, but I serve on the committee with her. She has served on these subcommittees of jurisdiction for quite some time, and she gets it, I mean, thoroughly. I'm a new puppy.
But when you're in there, and because I asked this in a way because I'm wondering who the standouts are, but then there are quite many hundreds of you out there. To what degree you would grade and say, between A and F, the average literacy of members of Congress on these Internet of Things issues, as we begin looking at a cashless society, begin looking at ledgers, digital ledgers, when we begin looking at I was at Intel the other day, and they've got a rug that you can walk across that can predict whether you're going to have a stroke. It's going to be a very different world that we're walking into.
I think younger members are probably a little bit more predisposed to technology, but I would also say that technology for many people, if you're a banker, you get technology in the financial services space. If you're a physician, you get it in the medical space. Very few people can see it broadly and appreciate how it can. If you're a governor or a mayor, you get so much of what you can do in terms of municipal services and how you can create efficiencies there. The same if you're in law enforcement. So I think everybody knows that technology can create a more efficient society. It can solve problems. Everybody knows sort of the privacy versus sort of open, the open platform versus keeping things private, and the cybersecurity issues, and they all manifest themselves kind of the same way in any number of different sectors of our economy and in our lives. But if you're not in the tech space every single day, it's very difficult, and I don't pretend to be an expert, to see how technology can sort of penetrate our society in a more encompassing way.
Before I go to the audience, I want to just ask you kind of an ecosystem question, because in part what we're talking about in technological advancement is it's partly science, partly innovation. You've got to have innovators out there. A lot of this is in partnership with academia. You've got to get the regulatory structure right. And we were just talking about the time when I worked in the Senate in the 1990s, and even then, Senator Jeff Bingaman, who was a real believer in technology, thought that our investments in things like NIH or the National Science Academies and others was diminishing. What would you say when we talk about this? Is this all going to happen anyway, or do you sort of see the United States making a mistake by not investing at the levels we once were in this wonderful ecosystem.
On the
that-
government side?
Yeah, I mean, the government has a role. I'd love to hear what you think that role ought to be.
So another member, Ro Khanna, who's a new freshman member from California, who's a Democrat, also gets this stuff extremely well. I think that if our country does not look at how our technology and our innovation is ultimately going to be embedded in the global economy, because all this stuff is like we're not creating technology that's just used in our country anymore. And as a consequence of that, I think that whether it's NIST or I think it's ISO, which is sort of the international society, those sort of cybersecurity and best practices types of international bodies where we've historically shown leadership and been pioneering, if we take a step back from that, I fear that the rest of I think investment will necessarily start going elsewhere, and we won't be viewed the way that we are now.
And that you worry about that.
I do. I think we should all worry about that. I mean, we are the most. We are still the world's economic superpower, and globalism diminishes that a little bit, but we still are. But you see that when you start outsourcing leadership or allowing other countries to step in because you don't want to for whatever reason.
That's great. Did you ever see the Jimmy Stewart movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington?
You
got a little Mr. Smith.
Probably because my hair is all
slicked
slicked
back.
back.
It's interesting. Yes, we got questions right here in the front, I guess. Right here in the front, yes.
Hi, I'm Joanna Brignolo. I'm a longtime attendee of these events. Can you comment on Elon Musk's new venture called Neuralink, wanting to have like a Borg-like relationship to machines, putting computer chips in our brains?
He has a lot of different ideas like that. Actually, so I can't. The one that actually, and I don't mean to be diversionary, but the one that I actually started thinking about, and the more I thought about it, the more I was like, yeah, that really could be a serious issue on the AI side of war robots, right? And like, what could happen if a foreign hostile nation had a machine here and was just able to push a couple buttons and could cause mass chaos? And I never really thought about that before, but I started thinking about that. And I think he even made a statement like, we need to get out in front of this now, because it's coming and it's coming.
He worries about
quickly.
AI, and Vladimir Putin actually said the nation that controls AI controls the world, and Elon in response says it started.
And I would look how sophisticated Russia was in terms of intelligence gathering for our there was an effort to create chaos and disorder and hostility amongst ourselves by a foreign actor. And I think that will continue, and I think AI and technology is a threat in that respect. And that's where I think that's where global leadership and even American leadership, just in terms of the security of our country, is reason enough why you can't sort of cede any ground.
Do you think just to follow up on this, and then I'll take another question, are the hearings on these things, I don't follow them closely enough, are they of the quality and standard that they're good enough to begin thinking about bots and AI and what may be coming down, or are we fighting the battles of the past?
I think some of it is reactive, some of it seeks to be forward-looking. Some of it is, I think, trying to determine whether we need a statutory response, or if are we comfortable that the regulatory agencies, whomever they may be, in a given on a given issue set, are receptive and are hospitable to what's happening in the innovation space.
Yeah, right here, please.
Hi, I'm Miriam Romani with Global Cyber Alliance. The question I have is, we are expecting 50 billion Internet of Things devices by 2020. How, without making sure security is built in from the beginning in the production of these devices, do we ensure that safety, security, privacy, some of the things you touched on, are going to stay intact and the trust in the internet is going to be maintained?
Great question.
It is. I think that, let me make a couple points here. Number one, government alone will never be able to deal with that. I mean, it ultimately it's probably more of a private sector issue than it is a government issue, because if the private sector doesn't get it right, then you won't get the value that you need to create. That's number one. Number two, the single biggest issue that government has to deal with, from my perspective on IoT, which is necessarily a government function, is spectrum management. So there's legislation out there right now, like, how much data will IoT need, or how much capacity, bandwidth from a spectrum management perspective? And you see these reverse auctions, and we don't know. And I think that we really need to chart that path and do those sort of predictive analytics so that we are collapsing spectrum for our, let's just call them legacy media outlets that don't need what they have. And look at ways that we're doing emergency response and some public functions which can be on the same spectrum as others and just sort of supersede or superimpose themselves when they need, rather than having their own bands, because IoT is going to take up more space. Right. We know that already, and that's purely a government FCC issue.
Right. Do you in this line, which I think is a great question on the kind of issue of security broadly and kind of deal with this, Mark Warner, Senator Warner, who you've been tied up with on food deserts, he has basically tried to put legislation outside the U.S. government, which does buy a lot. It basically sets, creates markets, saying we shouldn't be buying anything that doesn't have the ability for security patches, where the vendors aren't committed to patching inevitable possible problems within the system. Would you support that kind of thing?
It's obviously sounds sensible to me. I want to look a little deeper at what is precise legislation.
I know it's always the details, but we tweet that out. Sounds sensible to me. Hashtag. Ladies and gentlemen, Ryan Costello, thank you very, very much for joining us.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you. Okay, I think we have. I guess I am calling. Okay. Hey, everybody. I'm calling Congresswoman Anna Eshoo to the stage. Come join us. Hey, good to see you, Anna. Thank you so much for joining us. Nice warm welcome for Congresswoman. Thank you.
Let me sit next to you
we'll
here?
go right here.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll do a little fireside chat with you. Thanks for joining us. So how was
I'm
yesterday
delighted.
for you?
How was yesterday?
Yeah.
Well, last night was great.
Yeah, was it so what did you guys have any down
That
ticket?
sounds a little.
No, I mean, I asked the congressman the same question. He said, lots of Dems picked up seats in Pennsylvania. So I'm just sort of interested, were there California races that were down ticket that mattered?
No.
Nothing in California?
We didn't have anything in California. This is an off year for California.
I see.
Whereas Virginia and some other places very purposefully hold their gubernatorial elections down ballot in the off year, which is really quite interesting.
So Congressman Costello just said you're one of the greats. He said he's looking forward to getting to know
Well, he's
you
really
better.
nice.
He said he's still working on it.
Nice.
But we were basically kind of looking and kind of trying to project ourselves forward 10 years or so. Look at this Internet of Thing and this kind of we're all connected, and asking fundamental questions about what that world looks like, and kind of looking at what the trade-offs are between our security and the opportunities. And I'm just interested because I know you've been on both sides of that. Silicon Valley loves you, and yet you've been out there raising a lot of the big concerns about data, privacy, security. So how do you get those equities right?
Well, one hopes that we will get the equities right. I don't know. I think, sometimes we do. And then a new administration comes in and doesn't like it and wipes it out, i.e. privacy and the internet. It took a long time to accomplish that. And it was like just a bolt of lightning struck. And it seemed like a matter of congressional minutes, and it was gone. It was just gone. And I think of all the years of my congressional life that I fought for that, and I had legislation on it. So obviously, we all hope that we get it right. We understand that what we do is it takes a long time to build a legislative effort and get it over the line. You want to make sure that you don't, I think, that you don't set specific standards in legislation. You don't do the inner engineering. You leave that to the private sector or to an agency in the government that knows how to set those standards, because technology moves so quickly. It can be outdated before the ink is dry. So you really have to be very careful about it. But having said that, we have a responsibility for the public good in the country. So all of the people that come to us with legitimacy have their own interests. And that's the way our system works. So you need to listen very well, I think, to the best people that really know what they're talking about. And I'm not afraid to ask what I would call a sophomoric question, because I'm not an engineer, and I never wanted to be one. I love what I do, but I need to know what they do, how they do it, and how it enhances our work. There are two big things, I think, in terms of this issue of the Internet of Things. We know that we have been part of a digital revolution. There's no question about it. I think in the beginning, there were many people that thought of it as a luxury item, but now this has permeated our lives. And I'm very proud of it, because it's American genius that invented it. So this is an example of I think, a continuation of the genius of the framers, because they were the original innovators in terms of their thinking. They were entrepreneurs, and they certainly were risk takers. So I like to think that that's in our DNA.
But did they
And
build
it
checks?
certainly
Did
is.
they build checks and balances into the digital?
They did. No, they didn't. That's our job to do.
I see.
That's our job to do. We stand on their shoulders.
Why do you think?
Yeah.
Why do you think it is so hard when you know? I know that you were interviewing the CEO of Equifax in a hearing recently, and kind of tough on him. And,
Why not?
And I remember Andy Grove.
143 million people
Right.
were affected by that.
Yeah.
So
how?
I don't think
you've
it's
been
time
at this
for
for a
Tea
while.
Party.
How many Equifaxes do you think are out there still yet to unfold?
I can't tell you that. I think that there is, with interoperability comes vulnerability. And we live in an increasingly connected everything. That's what the Internet of Things is really about, that it spreads out and touches everything. So it's not only what kids use today to do their homework. They need to be connected. They need spectrum in order to be connected.
Congressman Costello just talked about that. in
Yeah.
fact. Yeah.
But it's also what a farmer can plant in the ground to inform him about the condition of the soil and what it may need. So it has permeated everything. Two things: privacy and a national security issue, cybersecurity. In my district, we have, they're really right on the edge of bringing this out now. Driverless cars.
Right.
There's also more than one enterprise that I have visited with that is working on public transportation, driverless vehicles. Now imagine, and that they depend on interoperability.
Right.
But imagine the bad guys and what they can do. So you have traffic, we depend on synchronized lights, except Washington, D.C. doesn't have them. They haven't heard of them yet.
Only 15th
That's
Street.
right. Well, I'm not familiar with that one.
15th Street's the
But,
only
it just
place of
amazes me.
heaven
Yeah,
in
it's-
synchronized lights in
My
the
mother
city.
used to call it, bye-bye, Anna, you're going to the old country. Yeah, from California.
But it's an
So
issue. I mean, David
it-
Ignatius
it
has a
is-
novel out.
These are the two areas that public policy makers, together with those that are the creators of these inventions, we need to
So
think
what do you
these
blow
things
the
through.
whistle on? It's interesting. You know, David Ignatius has a novel out. I don't know if any of you have read it, called The Director, and in it, the CIA director, he's into spy novels. His car is hijacked. His car is hacked and taken over and wrecked in this, and we've seen something like that. I also know there's an effort by auto companies like Toyota, GM, and others to raise questions with those of you in Congress about the privacy of drivers, because the digital tracking that is going on our phones is now going on in our cars. So it's raised a lot of questions where you have unsuspecting consumers that don't realize, in fact, that their digital footprint is so exposed.
Well, I think that number one, what do we want to achieve? We want consumers to have confidence in these products
Right.
so that they buy them. And that's in the interest of the manufacturer, the designer, the creator of these ideas and products. That's number one. The bookend to that is that we need to understand how to prevent the hacking that's taking place. Congress has, I guess, with some legitimacy. It's not like a high point for me, but it is. The effort has been: how soon do enterprises have to report publicly that their system has been hacked? Well, I guess that's interesting, but it's already been done to you. It's already been done to you. And this sense that people have of helplessness when these breaches are so enormous, 143 million people. That's a lot of people.
But Congresswoman-
So, I need to get a plug in here.
Please.
So I have asked just about everyone I've met in Silicon Valley the same question. What would you do to address this? And to a person, they advised me that you have to work on prevention and that there are two pillars to this issue. One, systems have to be clean. There has to be hygiene to a system, number one. The other bookend is that you have to have excellent, consistent security management. So the first is
And this is
easier
part of
to
your
do.
best practices legislation.
That's right. Senator Orrin Hatch is carrying the bill in the Senate, and I have it in the House. So, and we've left the setting of standards to NIST,
Right.
because they know how to do it. It's not mandatory; it is voluntary. But my overall goal in this is obviously to reduce the number of breaches because people will know what to do, and that at some point, consumers will consider this the good housekeeping seal of approval, so that the
I guess the one question I have
manufacturers,
for you-
whatever, of a product or a
Yeah.
service can say, we follow
Right.
whatever it is.
I agree with everything you said. I
It
think
sounds
what
so
I find,
simple that it's, you think, why isn't
you
someone
have
doing
different
it?
systems, different tiers, different ages, and I guess what I find interesting, and I have not seen much media on it since the Equifax attack, but the same week the Equifax attack was announced, we had the revelations about the Securities and Exchange Commission having been hacked, so that the Edgar online system. So this is deeply.
I don't think
hidden.
anything
Yeah.
in terms of hackers is
Right.
sacred.
Right. So I
You
think
know,
in that
and
area, but this is the U.S. government, and then didn't disclose for 2 years that in fact it had been penetrated, but yet the SEC requires public companies to tell them. So there seems to be sort of very inconsistent standards out there, even among those in the government that are.
Jumbled. It's
Yeah.
jumbled. And I think it's jumbled because people don't know quite what to do about it, most frankly. I mean, that's just the bottom line. Because if they did, they already would have come up with something. I don't know how many members of Congress have given, and candidates, State of the Union type speeches about cybersecurity.
So-
and I read them, but they don't have any solutions in them.
Right.
They talk about what we're talking about.
Right.
143 million here, SEC over here, the Target, Neiman Marcus, Macy's, you name it. Maybe it isn't Macy's, I don't know, but
So what do we do? So I want to go to the audience in a second, but what do we do given the very realist picture you just gave us, where it's jumbled, it's confused, you're promoting best practices, but clearly not everyone is engaged in those. So do we just, in order to get to the future, do we just embrace the wild ride, and do we just embrace the fact that we're going to have serious problems? Or do
well, I don't think
do we
that's
take
the
a
way,
pause?
I don't think that's the best of America to just say, well, let's
so
just,
what- I mean, I'm asking
let's
you
just
how to-
get on the back
yeah.
of the turnip
Give us the
truck,
Anna
and we know it's
Eshoo-
going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah, give us the Anna Eshoo
Well,
brand.
I think that, first of all, 90% of all of this is in the private sector. 10% is government. That's an important 10%, including all of our agencies that are connected to our intelligence operations. So that 10% is a very important 10%. I think that if we come up with the best practices and standards, and it works for companies, small, medium, and large, there'll be a big return for that. Because it's far costlier to be hacked than it is to make sure that passwords are changed, all the things that need to be done in terms of security management, and that a system is clean. I don't think that's asking too much of anyone in the private sector or in the public sector as well. I have other problems with what has taken place in the public sector because I don't think they know what they're buying. But that's a whole nother story. You could do a seminar on that one.
Excellent.
Yeah.
We probably will.
Yeah.
Yes, Stacy, question right here. Hey, how are you?
Actually, my name's Al Gombas. I'm from the State Department. I want to commend you, first of all, on your being such a great champion on protecting religious minorities around the world. Thank you for that. I'm curious what you think might be the best way to incentivize corporate America to do some of the things that you're talking about.
Right.
Simply having them with best practices and things in the legislation, I think you may need something more than that to get them to want to do these kinds of things on the front end in the design of these things, and to have these protections in place before they roll out. And I'm just curious what you think the best incentive structure might be for something like this.
Thank you.
Thank you and thank you for your kind words. I appreciate it. And thank you for your public work
So happy
for
he's
our
employed
country.
at the State
Yeah.
Department.
I'm glad to hear there's someone there.
Yeah.
They are unsung heroes.
Yes.
And I have met so many of your colleagues all over the world, and it's a great source of pride. Great source of pride in your knowledge and your service. First of all, I think it's in the interests of a company to avoid being hacked. It's costly. It's costly in terms of the reputation of the company. It's costly in terms of trying to repair something after it has happened. It's costly. It's just costly all around, all the way around. So I don't think there's anyone that would raise their hand and say, I'd rather not do anything and be hacked. I don't think that we have thought this through well enough that we would have gotten to the second decade of the 21st century and not figured this out. And it's amazing to me, these two pillars that I've spoken about, these are people from the industry that have told me this. And they helped refine some of the different things, to tweak the legislation to help us in it. So I think that prevention is very important. Prevention you can use different sectors. It's better to prevent illness than to have to pick up the tab afterward. Prevention in this whole area, I think, is where we need to focus, take it seriously. And I think that because this is such a global enterprise now of breaking into
Right.
systems, that those that are the geniuses that will build out the next generation and the generation after that of technology, they certainly are going to be mindful about making it as secure as possible. But what one human being can build, there's someone else that can undermine it.
Let me just ask you very quickly before we close. Will Hurd, Congressman Will Hurd, has put this idea on the table that I find really intriguing about a cyber national guard, saying that the government and the various agencies and departments really can't compete with the private sector in terms of pay. You could create something where people could come in for a few years, do national service by the way of this, go back into industry, and it would create opportunities, and it would create greater literacy, in fact, around the country. Are you interested? Would you support
I think it's
something
great.
along those?
I would. I think it's a wonderful idea. I didn't put it into legislation, but when I served on the House Intelligence Committee almost a decade, I thought that it was really very important because for people in the intelligence community, and that's several agencies, and they spend a lot of money on their equipment, to do roundtables. So we brought some of the best and brightest from Silicon Valley
Right.
To Washington so that they could sit and talk to them, have good conversations, but have the policymakers there so that they would absorb and understand, because it is a responsibility of ours. We're the ones that do the legislation with the money. You want to know where the money is going, right?
Right.
What you're buying. That's why I said you can have someone that has been an exemplary public servant in the federal government, and they're a GS whatever, and they rise through the ranks, and then they become the person that's in charge of purchasing.
Yeah. Well, ladies and
There have
gentlemen.
been some costly mistakes that we've made, so.
Well, we look forward to seeing how you navigate all of this down the road. And thank you so much for spending time
Oh, I'm
with us.
delighted.
Ladies
It's
and
an
gentlemen,
honor to have been
Congresswoman
invited.
Anna
Thank you
Eshoo.
so much to you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
you're
very much.
wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. And next, a session produced by our underwriter. Please welcome Jim McCarthy, the Executive Vice President of Innovation and Strategic Partnerships at Visa. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you all very much. I promise I won't make this too painful for you all. We'll get back on the main reason you were here. I want to talk a little bit about how Visa views the Internet of Things. I think most of you all probably have some type of card. I mean, in a city like Washington, D.C., and certainly developed markets around the world, these pieces of plastic have revolutionized, I think, most of our lives. I just made a trip around the world literally last week: Hong Kong, Singapore, London, Charlotte, North Carolina, back to San Francisco. And I had this device, I had one other card, and I had my passport, and I was able to travel without having to think about getting cash before I left. But the fact of the matter is, even though this device is now 60 years old, and we think about it as, again, pretty magical, certainly in developed markets, the fact of the matter is that this is a device is actually pretty constraining, because for the majority of the time that Visa has been around, the only place this worked is where you see lights on this map, right? So when you think about the typical card, whether it's a swipe, a tip, a dip, or a tap, it required wireline telephony and good electricity. And so, you can see here there's a lot more dark on that map than there is light, and certainly there are people living in those cities, doing commerce in those cities, but disconnected from the world as we know it. And then something called the internet happened, right? And so the internet started to connect the globe, it flattened the world, and the network fundamentally changed the way commerce has occurred. And so as we sit here today, not only do I have this device here on my card, but that same device is, here on my phone in the case of, where is it, right here? Apple Pay, right? So there it is. And to what the congressman was just saying, not only is it the same card that the bank issued me, but actually it's a different card number that's bound to this device. So we do plan, and we do think ahead with respect to, that bad people will take these devices. And so if someone actually took this off my phone and tried to replay it, we know it has to come off this phone, and we kill the transaction before it ever occurred. So obviously mobile phones have started to change the landscape. But then even here, this is the new Fitbit Ionic. Oops. Press that. And there's the same B of A debit card, except it's got a different card number associated with it. And again, it's tied to this device. And so the Internet of Things is happening around us. And again, so you've got Apple Pay, you've got Android Pay, you've got Samsung Pay, you've got mobile devices, you've got QR codes coming out of China, completely changing the way commerce is occurring around the world. And we're just scratching the surface. So when we think about how that world is going to change, number one, mobile and e-commerce are commodities. Amazon's the world's largest retailer. Square is now a top 5 merchant in the United States, connecting consumers and merchants and allowing commerce to occur. So much so that last year was a historic year in the payment space, whereby payment was done more in electronic means, including ACH than previously, and cash and check are now actually smaller, a minority share. And so the world has moved to digital first. We need to think like digital first. We need to think about software and the pace of change because it's only going to accelerate. And nowhere do you see this more prevalently than in the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas every year. So last year we saw LED screens that hang on the wall by magnets, which by the way are now powering the new Apple devices and the Samsung devices. We see robotics. We had, I think there were 14 auto manufacturers at the show last year on connected cars. And again, you heard the representative talk about connected cars and driverless cars. And so the world is being plumbed for this Internet of Things concept. It's here, it's real, it's not something that's coming. And so when we think about this, the one thing all these devices have in common is that, as I said, not only are they electronic, but they're connected, right? And they're talking. And the way commerce is going to occur in the future is going to evolve in very significant ways. We're already seeing it with biometrics. We all have Alexa or Bixby or OK Google in your house. You can talk to devices. You're going to see more and more of the devices talking to themselves. You'll see machine learning come into the mix. Right? So your behaviors with your permissions will allow commerce to occur based on how you previously have purchased. And so again, driving more convenient ways that devices themselves will be able to automate the way we live. And again, payments and commerce is going to be at the middle of that. And so for Visa, the real big change is when we think about IoT and unbound commerce, it's the fact that these connected devices now allow us to get access to the part of the world that used to be dark, right? Places where commerce couldn't occur electronically, places where consumers were cut off from the financial mainstream. And so from an access perspective and helping the underserved and the unbanked come into the financial mainstream, the IoT environment is going to completely change the way commerce occurs and will actually be able to help people live their lives more effectively. And just to dimension it further for everybody, there's still $17 trillion of cash and check spend in the world that we think we can get at and help these people come into the financial mainstream and really impact people's lives, not only in developed markets, but in emerging markets as well. So thank you. Please enjoy the conference. And I want to thank, again, the folks at The Atlantic for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you to Jim. And now for a conversation on the public and private sectors working together, please welcome to the stage Shri Ilaprulu, Global Lead and Senior Manager of Public Sector IoT at Amazon Web Services, Ellen Huang, the Program Manager of Innovation Management at the Office of Innovation and Technology for the City of Philadelphia, and Edward Abrams, Vice President of Enterprise IoT at Samsung Electronics America. And here to lead the conversation, Jillian White, a Senior Associate Editor at The Atlantic. Jillian, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So before we get into our conversation, I just want to do a little stage setting for the audience. So I want each of you to tell us a little bit about your role and how it relates to IoT or how IoT is integrated into your role. Ed, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, thanks. So I lead the enterprise IoT efforts for Samsung in the U.S. That means my whole life, my whole job, everything I do is about IoT. My responsibilities are to bring together this huge conglomerate that I work for to bring all the piece parts and deliver integrated strategies and solutions for customers. I have everything from product development and design to interaction with customers and building a partner ecosystem to help solve problems.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ellen Huang. I'm the Program Manager for Innovation Management with the City of Philadelphia. And my primary role is working in the central IT department to the city. And I manage our Smart City PHL initiative. That is our strategic program that is engaging all the different departments that are inside city government to understand what types of advanced technology deployments different departments are working on and how we can collaborate together. And so my main priority right now is to develop our technology roadmap on how Philadelphia is going to establish its smart city infrastructure.
And I'm Sri Ilaprolu, part of Amazon Web Services public sector team. I head up our IoT practice focused on public sector customers. So at AWS, we define public sector as governmental bodies, that's state and local, municipal, federal, defense, et cetera. Educational institutions all the way from K-12 into higher ed research institutions, as well as not-for-profit institutions. So think about American Heart Association, Red Cross, and institutions like that. So as part of the IoT practice, our role and my team's role is to work with customers and partners to build a strong ecosystem, all the way from sensor manufacturers to connectivity providers into solution providers, so that when cities or federal institutions or educational institutions, anyone for that matter around the world, they're looking to deploy IoT or sensor-based solutions, we have a full complement of capabilities that we bring to bear. In that role, I work with customers around the world, so multiple geographies. I was joking earlier in the back room there that I travel quite often. That's probably not an understatement there. But that's part of the job, is to work with customers, guide them through the process as they're taking their first steps into the sensor world or connected world, what the process could look like, provide them best practices, and show them the path so that their projects become successful in the long run.
So I've heard it said before that when we think about Internet of Things, sometimes the focus is too much on the thing, on the actual technology that's being developed, and not so much on kind of the broader picture. So I'm wondering how, Ed and Sri specifically, how do you guys think about keeping in mind the technology that's available and that you're excited about, but also kind of the broader solution that you're trying to work on?
Well, I'll tell you, that's the thing that keeps me up most at night, because oftentimes as we start to engage with customers, as we start to have IoT-based conversations, it starts with that technology. It starts with, I have these things, I want to do something with them. It's like when I was a kid and you had an erector set. I'm dating myself, right? You wanted to build something. And really, our whole strategy and our whole approach is to turn that conversation around, to really start with, what is it you're trying to accomplish? What problem are you solving? What benefit do you want to bring to your customers, to your constituents? And then let's talk about the things that are in your kit bag to allow you to do that effectively. If you don't start with an outcome-based discussion, at the end of the day, you end up with a really cool erector set of stuff that you can't do anything with. And so we really push that on our customers and on our own thinking, because we are, at our core, a company that builds stuff. But we start by building based on what customers need.
Sure.
And I'll echo those sentiments. The way I talk to customers and those interactions go is starting from the outcome. What is it that you're trying to achieve, and work your way backwards? And for me and our teams, data is at the center of all of this, right? The reason why you deploy sensors is, number one, to collect data. The more you get, the more you're able to analyze and therefore make better decisions. And number two, in some cases, you want to send that intelligence back out to the physical world and react to things real time. So if you start looking at the data as the core or the center of the solution, and work your way backwards to what kinds of sensors do I need to deploy, and more importantly, why? What am I trying to accomplish? What kind of data do I need to collect in order to make the right decisions? And then what reactions, real-time or latent-based reactions, do I want to send into the physical world? So I think looking at the problem, starting with the goal in mind, working your way backwards, identifying what kind of technologies do you need, whether it's sensor-based, or in some cases, as we're going through the conversation, we'll find out that it's not really sensor-based solution that the customer needs. It may be data analytics, right? They already have the data, they just don't know how to analyze it, so conversation tilts towards that. So I think looking at the outcome or the desired outcome, working your way backwards, and keeping data at the center of all of that.
Could I chime in?
Yeah,
so I think I'm a little bit unique on the panel in that I am the customer that they're talking about
exactly.
oftentimes.
Why we put you in the middle.
All right, it still has to go through a competitive process. No, I'm just kidding. So one of the things that has been really important to us over in Philly, and that I'm finding in a lot of other city government groups, is that we are trying to better understand what it is departments are trying to solve for, and that's something that is shared here. And I think what's exciting right now is that we are in a time where government is really being challenged to not only participate in the tech economy, but also become a partner in developing what we are trying to go in terms of advanced technology, the future, and all of that stuff. And so a lot of the job that I have to do is to go to different departments, understand what is your priority? What is it you're trying to work for? What is it you're trying to solve for? A good anecdote that I can share with you today is, and we were talking about this in the back room, is I met with our Parks and Recreation team, and for the 80 plus park sites that we have all across Philadelphia, there's only 3 park rangers for the entire city park system, which is kind of ridiculous. But the capacity is low. And one of the things that they have a challenge with is noise complaints in these park systems. You'll have people come out from the neighborhood, they'll bring these huge concert grade speakers in their vans, and they'll just blast it over the weekend, and the neighbors that are residing right next to these parks, they have complaints. Right now, what ends up happening for the most part is that Monday morning, you'll check your voicemail and you'll have these noise complaints that have already passed and gone, and no one was able to address that complaint. Part of the reason why is because the park rangers are roaming around, they're working overtime, but they have no way of prioritizing what sites they need to be visiting and making sure that they have their attention on. And so where IoT could play a role in this is actually being able to deploy sensors that connect these park rangers to when there's an instance of some level of noise in these park systems, actually ping them in real time, and they could actually know exactly where they need to go during their shift. And so in that way, we're actually able to make their routes more efficient. It could be more focused. But that conversation wouldn't have happened unless we understood, like, here is the problem over at Parks and Rec. We don't have enough staff capacity. This is one of our largest complaints that we're getting from our neighborhoods. What could we do about it? And then you bring in the technologist in the room and you present that challenge. And I think this is where it's exciting for you all. It's like, we'll build it, right? So,
absolutely. We started to architect a solution in the back room. We really did.
Yeah.
It started with AWS data down to wearables for park rangers that routed them to the right place at the right time.
Right.
This is how the process needs to work, though.
And then we procure it, and then we go through that really nice contracting process that we call RFPs.
All right, so we just kind of got a little view of how that might work. I'm wondering, when we think more broadly about making cities smarter on a broader scale of addressing not just one problem, not just the park ranger problem, but all of these problems that so many cities have, and they're different in each city. What are the biggest challenges that you guys are facing when it comes to building the products, and then what are the biggest challenges that you're facing when it comes to, in Philadelphia, assessing those problems and then getting those tools built?
Should I start?
Yeah, go for it.
So I'll address in 2 different areas. One, which is more of the kinds of problems that we're already seeing with cities, which is, I'll refer to it as a silo effect, right? Where cities have individual departments within cities may have moved forward, purchased or acquired solutions that do the job, but that's it. They don't talk to other systems. There's no way of integrating the systems behind the scenes, which is a problem, because if you think about it, a large city, there is so much that needs to be shared between teams, between solutions. For example, if there's a traffic routing system or a transportation system, there's value in that system being able to react and integrate with public safety systems, so that your police and fire teams know when there is an accident or an issue on the roads, they can react to it real time, as opposed to waiting for that whole complaint process to take its way. So that's one problem that we're seeing consistently. And the good news there is a lot of cities are stepping back, even if they've started on the smart city path, holding plans in place and stepping back a little, thinking about that horizontal layer that needs to be in place before they start full force into smart city solutions. The second area that we're starting to see some concerns from cities, and we're helping and addressing in that space, is this is an emerging space, right? There's not a lot of successful blueprints that other cities can just copy. Most cities are still in the early steps of the journey. So experimentation becomes extremely important. And the process that currently exists, as Ellen was saying, the procurement process, the whole acquisition process, doesn't lend itself easily for experimentation, right? So what if there was an option where a city can pick one or multiple solutions that address a specific problem, try pilots or POCs, proofs of concepts, in parallel, get the results in a matter of weeks, maybe months, depending on the solution, and then decide to move forward with the solution that makes the most sense. That's another area where agility becomes a huge, very important factor that cities need to consider, and that's an area that we're starting to see and help in that space as well.
And do you agree with that?
I agree with everything you said, Sri. I'll add two other points that we see. One is that the ubiquity of delivery, depending upon what you are doing, is a challenge. All of your constituents in the city need access to information, need access to technology. You've got to deliver it in a way that it can go across multiple devices, multiple platforms, multiple ways of it being consumed. Many times, and we were talking about this before, in multiple languages, right? So that ability to take that data, take the insights, not the data, the insights, and get them down to that last mile is another big challenge we're seeing. The other thing I'll say is that this is not just a problem for the public sector. The same problem exists in private sector. When you're trying to connect different departments in a hospital or in a hospital network to one another, when you're trying to connect disparate departments in an enterprise together, these same issues exist. Maybe it's not the antiquated procurement process, but just even though we're talking about smart cities, recognize these same problems challenge everybody regardless of public or private sector.
Yeah. Ellen, what are the biggest hurdles that you're facing when you're thinking about how to bring smart city IOC technology to not just the Parks Department, but to everyone in the city?
Yeah, I think an elephant in the room oftentimes in my conversations are our legacy systems. They're our favorite. We've had them for a long time. We're almost married to them. We are married to them. But I think a lot of people right now are still at a place where they're like, we have this hunky, old, outdated system, and how are we gonna, and we're still trying to work through that, and we're going through middleware, and it's costing us, X amount of dollars, and we've had to renew the contracts over, several administrations. And I think a lot of people are frustrated by these huge contract opportunities and large technology, these technology refreshes that happen over the course of many years. And they're like, okay, and now you want to talk about advanced technology and drones and integration of all these different things. We can't get it even right in our department. And so I think working with the folks who have gone through a lot of those challenges over the last decade or so in city government, I think is one of the most important things about the Smart City conversation is understanding their pain points, understanding where do they want to go when they first conceived of these projects, and how do we actually support them in solving some of the challenges that they were facing over the last several years. And what kind of new solutions have emerged since then that can actually alleviate a lot of the burdens that they're experiencing now? And are there ways in which we can work with existing contracts to actually to maybe pursue a different path? So those are some tricky conversations. They take time. They take a lot of relationship building. We are central IT, so in a lot of ways, we are customer facing in the way that actually our colleagues are our customers in city government. And so a lot of that is also making sure that each department knows that we want to be their partner. We don't want to impose a new standard on them. But on the flip side, it's also in terms of smart city conversation is this notion of interoperability, being able to integrate different departments, data sets, their software, their hardware systems to be communicating across the city. And so when they feel a really strong ownership of their own system and their own way of doing things and their own technology, and then asking them like, hey, do you mind having a conversation with this other department? They're thinking about doing something really similar. We want to make sure that moving forward it all talks together. That requires a lot of time. But I think that the light at the end of the tunnel is that people are really excited and hungry to get there finally, because for so many years they've been working under these like legacy systems and things just constantly being frustrating and being really expensive. And so this notion of sharing that burden across the city, I think, is something that has shed a bit of hope in city government.
I want to let our audience know that after I ask a few more questions, we're going to come to you guys for some questions. We'll have runners, so think about your questions now, condense them down, and then just raise those hands up high once we get to the question and answer period. So my colleague Laura Bliss recently wrote a piece about smart cities and about the concern that as we integrate smart city technology, there will still be some people who get left behind, right? And oftentimes that those will be some of the people who could most benefit from systems that operate better, that are cheaper, et cetera. You mentioned the need to be able to deploy information to everyone in a bunch of different ways, sometimes in different languages, et cetera. I'm wondering how you guys are thinking about solving that problem. So not just the issue of how to get this technology to city governments, but then how city governments can wisely deploy that so it's meeting the needs of everyone.
So there's a lot that we're actually trying to do in this space, and it's part of recognizing that as a technology provider, we have to give back as part of these solutions as well, right? You can't take and deploy a solution that's got a $1,000 endpoint for the constituent that they have to access, right? You have to think about ways that you can deliver technology that is consumable. And if that means you've got to put different endpoints, different experiential points out into the marketplace, that's part of the investment that you have to make. That's part of the investment you have to make as a partner in a city environment. But the reality is there's no clean, easy answer. You're not just going to parachute in a bunch of tech and let people go grab it where they need to. We talked about there's a whole group of constituents who are afraid to touch technology. Right? And so part of what you have to really be thinking about is what are the right ways to drive interaction that are going to get usage, that are going to get embraced in an environment? Is it going to be voice-based technology? Is it going to be tablet or touch-based technology? Is it something we haven't thought about yet? VR, AR types of interactions. But this is where, again, there's no clean, here's the answer. But these are the things that you need to challenge the partners you work with to help you solve for, right? It gets back to our first comment about start with the problem. If the problem is getting technology into areas of underutilization, right? There's a lot of conversations that we can have about how to do that. I'm not going to give you one answer because it would depend upon that individual conversation.
Yeah, how are you guys thinking about that, Alan?
Yeah, so I'll echo some of the sentiments, right? So one of the things that and stepping back at the broader Amazon level, we always look at things from how can we make it easy for consumers to be able to produce, on the retail side, obviously it's for purchasing things, but for any other area as well, how can we make it easy for consumers and customers to use the services that we're bringing to market? Which means lowering the technology barrier and making it as easy to use, at the same time, security baked right from the get-go so that the end user doesn't have to think about how do I make sure that it is secure from a transaction point of view. Coming back to the smart city discussion, right? So the areas that you're touching on are more of the digital divide questions that we often get asked. Is this the modern technology, the sensor-based technology, is it only for technology-knowledged citizens, or is this something that everyone can take advantage of? Answer is absolutely everyone. That should be the end goal. Some of the ways that we're starting to see customers adopt this is voice technology, right? You've heard of Alexa, and we're starting to see the promise of Alexa in state and local space much rapidly than we expected. A number of states and cities have incorporated Alexa as one of the mediums through which citizens interact with IT systems. I'll give you some examples. If you are in state of Utah and you're in the process of driving license or driver's license, all of that transaction and interaction can be done through Alexa in your own home. If you're in state of Georgia, 78 plus digital properties from state of Georgia are all Alexa enabled. So you can either walk into an office, you can go online and navigate through the web properties, or you can just use your voice, which is a very easy and natural way that humans interact in, use that as a medium to interact and get the information that you need, as well as submit information when it's appropriate. Right? So we're starting to see voice also become one of the main mediums or streams in which interaction between humans and IT systems is starting to take effect. That helps because it lowers the barrier for, if you think about people that are not as comfortable using technology, or maybe in cases where they do not have access to technology, and taking voice technology and embedding it into everyday systems. It doesn't have to be through an Echo or an Echo Dot. It could be any speaker-based system which can be voice enabled. Right, even your smartphones, even on a browser, right? Where instead of me navigating and trying to find systems, touch a microphone icon on a website, start talking to it as naturally as you would. And sites will respond back, and it navigates and allows you to interact with it in a voice-based format. So that's another area that I think as we evolve, more and more solutions will start coming into play.
And did you want to quickly
Yeah,
answer?
I think for us, inclusion can't be and inclusion, it has to be at the center. You have to make it a point. You have to make it a priority. Otherwise, it just kind of gets thrown off to the side, and you maybe throw a few dollars there to do some sort of program or project. But when we talk about inclusion, we're trying to define that every step of the way. Where are we going to deploy this type of technology? Is it actually going to be deployed just downtown Center City where the tourists come? Or are we actually going to be able to negotiate a contract where businesses get to benefit because they're in a high traffic, high tourist, high business area? But in addition to that, are we going to be partnering with the right companies and the right deployment partners that actually also care about the Philadelphia community? I think one of the biggest challenges for us is that we are, sixth largest city in the United States, but we also have the highest rate of deep poverty of any large city in the U.S. We have 26% poverty rate. We also have a very low rate of literacy. So, digital literacy aside, just basic literacy is a really big problem for us. So I think in terms of voice-powered types of access for adults that have low rates of literacy would be a huge benefit for us in terms of getting access to services and communicating with city representatives. But I also think that for us, we want to make sure that they are coming along with us on this journey of talking about smart city, about contributing to, what does smart city in Philadelphia really look like? What does that really mean? And I think the challenge is that when you talk to a lot of people who are really close to the problems or in the neighborhood level and the hyper local economic initiatives, they're not even thinking about 5G. They're just thinking about, how do we get more gardens and food in our neighborhood? How do we make sure the education system is going to be better maintained and sustained? And how am I gonna get to my job in less than 2 hours because I have to go pick up my kid after work? There's a lot of these day-to-day things that a lot of people in our community and all across the country are facing in terms of poverty, in terms of low access to transportation. So for us, we really have to think beyond just IoT, and we have to think beyond just technology and think about it from a much more holistic perspective. Are there supportive programs that we can actually bridge alongside the technology? Really great example of the way we talk about inclusion really quickly is through our public health department. We have something called air management services, and they deployed air monitoring sensors across the city, and we're continuing to expand that program. And the reason why they monitor the air quality is because they have found through data that a lot of areas of where there are high rates of asthma and deaths associated with asthma attacks are happening in areas where there are really, really high air pollution. And we're also finding that, correlating to the other data is that those are also high rates of poverty there. And they're often in areas that are post-industrial in Philadelphia. And so when you layer all those different data sets, we're able to get a much better picture of what we're dealing with, of what the really big problem is. And to us, that's a part of inclusion. It's about being able to highlight those stories and being able to direct our budget and our policy to help those communities.
I think we might have time for one or two very quick questions.
Thank you. Miriam Romani with Global Cyber Alliance. Thank you so much to the panel. Really great discussion. I guess the question I have for the panelists is, when it comes to the promise of Internet of Things enabled smart cities, privacy and security could be hurdles to deployment. Yet, with all the smart city projects that are going around globally, there are a lot of good lessons learned that probably cities can start in some form of collaboration, learn from each other so that they don't repeat the same mistakes and provide that inclusion promise of technology. Are you working with other smart cities to learn from their best practices?
I think we're going to limit it to one person answering. So
The answer is a one-word answer, absolutely. Right? And that's part of sharing and part of learning is making certain that we're taking best practices and even worse practices and sharing and building off of them together.
all right, and then I think we have one more question.
Hey, this has been fascinating, a great conversation. Thank you guys for being here. This question is more for Ellen. How's the public sector, maybe Philadelphia specifically, adapted to your design thinking methodology, putting the consumer in the position to kind of be the developer as well? The private sector, we know is really good at the ready, fire, aim approach, but the public sector not so much. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, actually, prior to the whole Smart City initiative happening in the city, my team actually manages a program that trains city employees in human-centered design thinking. And so essentially bringing different methodologies of how we frame our problems and our challenges and how we want to go about solving them. So we have a few initiatives under that. And so I think in terms of just thinking about who is in city government in Philadelphia, there has been a huge movement to get municipal leadership as well as their employees to start thinking differently about the way they are looking to be more strategic about the way their day-to-day work looks like. And I think this is something that's happening across the country. You have these innovation groups that are seated in government, and I think a part of that process is also bringing actually in the private sector practices into government as well. So you have programs in San Francisco like the Startup in Residence. We do a lot of shared learning across different sectors in Philadelphia. And so anytime you want to tackle a challenge, we think about reaching out to entrepreneurial communities in Philadelphia, reach out to our private partners to think through things. I mean, just in the back room, we tossed up like 10 different ideas and things that I'm sure we'll each bring to our respective colleagues when we go back home. So I think those kind of conversations are absolutely happening. And I think the other exciting thing is that government is now part of this whole tech race. And it's getting people in government to get excited, but also challenge themselves to think beyond what they thought their yesterday's role as a city official looked like and thinking about tomorrow.
All right. Well, we could talk about this all day. I think that's where we're going to stop. Everyone join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, everyone. And next up, Sanjay Sarma, a professor of mechanical engineering and a vice president of open learning at MIT. And he's here with Atlantic Live contributing editor Allison Stewart. So Allison, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And for our folks in the audience, you probably know this, folks here at the museum, but for people who are watching us online, may not realize that you are one of the innovators of the Internet of Things.
Well, thank you.
But it's true. And you've described the Internet of Things as not a technology or a platform, but a way of thinking. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's interesting. People say, can I buy the Internet of Things? No, you can't. I'm sorry, because there's no store that sells the Internet of Things. Think of it like electricity. Think of architecture, building architecture, before we had electricity. Lighting, you had to have candles, and it had to be accessible, and someone had to go light the candles. There were no elevators, there were no escalators. The moment electricity appears, architects have to rewrite the rules, right? I mean, you design buildings differently. So the Internet of Things is a new design language. And if I may, I'll give you one example.
Please.
How many of you have used Zipcar or know about Zipcar? Okay. So think about this. Why are all the cars in a car rental together in a single parking lot? Why do you have to go to the airport to pick up a car? because you need to get the keys, right? The key has to be handed to you physically. And it's better, they're better off putting the cars together and having an office that can take your credit card and give you the keys. And when you return the car, someone's got to check the mileage. Now, the moment you have the Internet of Things, the key can be given to you remotely, and the mileage can be checked remotely. And what happens? Bam, Zipcar, which is the car is where you need it to be. So that's sort of where it comes from.
How has the way we, the collective, we approach the Internet of Things different than you anticipated?
I think we're doing it very incrementally. It's fundamental redesign, right? I mean, think about this. You're Avis, you have the Internet of Things, you go, maybe I can track the car and get data, right? You're Robin Chase, who's an alumna of MIT, and she goes, no. I need cars in parking lots, in grocery stores, next to people's homes, so they can just pick them up and go. So you got to really rethink the way you do things. And so that is sort of the topic of this other approach that I've written about, which is inversion, which is we have to move from a product-centered approach, which is you sell products, to you sell experiences.
It's very creative, what you describe.
It is. I think it sets you free, sort of you can really rethink things. I mean, Uber, to me, the way Uber is founded, the two founders were in Paris, they can get a taxi, and one turns to the other and says, I wish I could do this, and a car showed up. Right? And then they realized that they could do it. Now, today's cars are, when Uber was founded, cars were pretty dumb, and the smartphone basically turns a dumb car into a smart car. Right? That's basically what a smartphone does. So a smartphone is this magic wand that turns anything dumb, including me, into a smart thing, right? So I think we really we're at a very interesting cusp at a point in time where you can start reinventing everything, pretty much. Not everything, but a lot of things.
Going forward, what do you think what are going to be the determining factors in the evolution of IoT? What will have an impact? And conversely, what won't?
I think that you will see what I call massively parallel innovation. Avis did not come up with Zipcar. Two innovators came up with Zipcar. The Marriott didn't come up with Airbnb, right? By the way, Airbnb is this inverted thinking I talk about, where you work on the experience. One of the things I say about IoT is, trust me, if you think in this way, IoT will be useful. So with Airbnb, do you want to meet the person every time outside your room, outside your house when you give them the key? Well, smart locks are much more convenient. So eventually it went IoT. So it will happen naturally. My feeling is that this will be thousands of little innovations that slowly transform everything we do. And I'm not seeing the big companies even recognize this. I used to make fun of Ford, but then Ford seems to have recognized it, and they recently acquired a company called Chariot, which is sort of a Uber pool for vans, basically. Right? So they're getting it. They're getting it. So I think we'll see an unleashing of crowd innovation.
You've also said to businesses, you can't wait and see it. Think about this, really. This is just moving too fast.
Yeah. It's sort of like Usain Bolt, right? Usain Bolt knows when he's doing a 100 meters dash, he needs to be far faster than the two guys, one to his right, one to his left, right? Except you're going to be sideswiped by a race that's at 90 degrees to you, right? So what I mean by that is when Uber was founded, people thought it would compete with taxis, right? And the statistics are that I think Uber sales in San Francisco, the taxi sales were like $200 billion. And after Uber was founded, taxis went down to 120, and Uber is 500 million. So the total was 620 million. So yeah, it hurt taxis. But really whom they were competing with was Ford and Toyota, right? So you get sideswiped. You think you're competing with taxi companies, but actually it's coming from a different direction completely. I mean, the smartphone wasn't supposed to kill Canon or Minolta, but it did. So I think there's a sort of a old mindset. Somehow we're going to play by the rules, we'll compete by the rules. I'm sorry, that's not the future. The future is you can't sit around. You got to be really paranoid.
But it's interesting the way you describe the competition. So I work in the news business, and the two young women who founded The Skim, someone asked, who's your competition? Is it Good Morning America? Is it CBS This Morning? He said, no, it's time.
Yeah.
It's other people. We're fighting for people's time.
That's exactly right.
So in terms of the Internet of Things, when you think about competition, if you're a business person sitting out here and you want to get involved with the Internet of Things, how should you think about competition?
Here's how I'll put it. Let's take the most banal business you can think of, selling mattresses, right? It's the most boring business you can think of. Maybe there are a few more boring than that. Any mattress salesmen here? Okay. Truly, if you're in the mattress business, the way to think about it is you are not in the business of mattresses. You are in the business of sleep. So what does that mean? That means that you know, all these variables that tell you how well you slept, are you in REM sleep? The mattress needs to be into that. The mattress needs to figure out how much you've tossed and turned the night. The mattress ought to talk to the alarm clock and say, the guy is in REM sleep, don't wake the poor guy up right now, right? The mattress ought to have lights that light up when you get out of bed in the night so you don't stub your toe on the side table, right? So you've got to fundamentally think about what business are you in really? And this comes back to a famous quote from a marketing professor some 40 years ago. He said, say you're Black & Decker, are you in the business of selling drills or are you in the business of selling holes? And that might seem like a ludicrous idea, right? Who sells holes? Well, I can think of one company that sells holes. Can anyone guess? IKEA. They sell stuff with pre-drilled holes. So in a weird way, they compete with Black & Decker, right? So that's the way to think about it.
Man. You're blowing minds. Everyone's like, huh. So what does this mean for the consumer?
I think we're all going to become makers and creators and life hackers. We are already doing it. You know, just before I have to rush back home to meet my kid, and by the way, I was tracking her on her iPhone.
Of course. Good
Privacy
dad.
violation, okay. But I ordered an Uber, which is going to be waiting for me downstairs. We're adapting. And these are silent assistants that will make our lives safer, healthier, better, while we, of course, completely give up our privacy. That's a whole other story, but that's another panel. That's the next panel.
When you were describing earlier, the first answer you mentioned an architecture and a kind of language. Is there going to be a common architecture? Is this going to be a common language, and who is going to be responsible for that?
Well, so there will be many bad architectures. There are already many bad architectures. Cybersecurity is an extraordinary threat. We're not taking it seriously. The government's not taking it seriously. Unfortunately, you will see a nuclear plant hijacked or a power plant hijacked. You'll see it. There have already been warnings, and we're still, Equifax is nothing, right? So we're not taking it seriously. In fact, there is, I think, a clear architecture. It's fantastic because I thought of it. Must be great. But the basic idea today is we have a patchwork architecture. So if you open the door and the lights need to come on, they just say, I'll connect that with Wi-Fi. And then when the lights come on, maybe you want to turn the AC on, and the next vendor comes along and says, no, I'll connect the light to the AC using Bluetooth. It's a patchwork. That's not the way to do it. The way to think about it, in my view, is the real world will be mirrored in the cloud by an avatar world. So every light will have an avatar light, a guardian angel, right? Every door will have an avatar door. And so when you open the door, the avatar door knows, it opened. The other term for this is digital twins. And it's the digital twin, that door, that talks to the light. The reason is, if you replace the light bulb, you're not breaking a connection. You're just reinitiating it to the cloud. So now this won't work for real-time things. If you press your brake, you don't want the cloud involved before the brake actually actuates, right? You don't want the pedal to talk to the cloud and come back and then. So there are places where you need to go real time, but in a vast majority of cases, the cloud and this business of an avatar is going to be central. And by the way, if this seems strange, if you have an iPhone, you have an iCloud account. If you have an Android phone, you have a Google account. You have a Nest, you have a Nest account. If you have a Tesla, you have a Tesla account. So it's already happening.
At the beginning of your answer, you said that we're not taking it seriously enough, or the powers that be. Do they know how to take care
No,
of it?
I think that
that's like they might be taking it seriously, but they don't know what to do.
because these are fundamental as opposed to incremental changes, we're taking an evolutionary approach and the market will figure it out. And that's a mistake. It's a mistake on several fronts. Security, cybersecurity, privacy. It's also a mistake from the perspective of critical infrastructure. People say, well, my factory isn't connected to the internet. Nonsense. You have a computer in your factory. It controls your factory. Your computer is connected to the internet, right? Your factory is connected to the internet. You don't use it to control your factory, but some bad dude doesn't have those ethics. By the way, we have a 3D printer in our lab at MIT. And one day we came in and it had been taken over by WannaCry. That's an IoT attack, folks.
Emily, do I have time for one more question? Okay, just checking with the boss. What excites you the most about the future of IoT, and what worries you the most? Aside from security, we kind of covered that.
I think what excites me the most is the fact that we're breaking the rules and starting again.
Well, yeah.
And we're democratizing innovation. It's not a surprise that you have so many startups. It's happening because the rules are changing.
Do you see that in your students?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If I said to my student, hey, connect this to the internet, you'll all laugh. But she might come up with 5 different ways to do it. In fact, if you look at a physical object, you're going to ask yourself, how can a little bit of intelligence and some connectivity change it? You've got to ask yourself. So it is extremely exciting. Everything from healthcare to cars, again, not cars, transportation, right? Everything is going to go through reinvention. What worries me, apart from cybersecurity, is I don't think society is actually, I don't think we realize how big this is. And it's not just AI, it's not just IoT, it's intelligence, it's machine learning, computer vision, et cetera, they're all converging.
I'll let you get home to your kids.
Thank you.
Sanjay Sarma, nice to meet you.
Thank you.
And finally today, a conversation about striking the balance between innovation and security. So please welcome to the stage Chris Boyer, Assistant Vice President of Global Public Policy at AT&T, Hillary Kane, the Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at Toyota, and Jeff Green, Senior Director of Global Government Affairs and Policy at Symantec. And to lead the conversation, welcome back again, Allison Stewart.
Okay, there were some 3 big picture questions we were going to try to cover in 20 minutes. And also, we're going to have to take time for questions from the audience because usually at museum events, the audience has better questions than I do. So our big topics are, what are the risks involved with IoT? Should there be regulations in place? Who should be in charge? Whose responsibility? And how can consumers ensure their information is kept secure? These are numbers that you guys know, that various research firms say that 20 billion things will be connected by 2020. I think Cisco puts it at 50 billion. With these kind of numbers, Jeff, what do you see as the biggest security, or what is the biggest risk?
Classifying as the biggest is tough.
Or the ones that really you think about, keep you up at night.
I put them in buckets. There's physical risk, whether it is personal, the device you have at home, whether messing with your thermostat or some other connected device, water heater. There is identity risk, privacy, personal privacy, and also identity theft. There is systemic risk to our system. If you look at the Mirai botnet, which was last fall, we don't have to look farther than that to understand the impact that a relatively small volume of connected devices can have on the global internet, on the global economy. So it depends upon how you slice it. I would answer that question from a particular angle, I guess. Are we talking about critical infrastructure, health, transportation, where you are? There are a bucket of risk for all of them. I always feel compelled to say I don't think that we're facing the end of days because of this, but there is a lot of work that needs to be done.
So that attack was, I think it was last October. 2016. Did we learn anything from that? Or are we just sitting and waiting for another one?
I think we've made incremental progress. We definitely learned things. I don't know that we've incorporated the changes. Let's see as the next generation of devices come out. Next time you buy a device, if it has a default password and doesn't encourage or require you to change it, then you'll know that that manufacturer did not learn anything from this. But there are some who did. So that's the first easy test that we have to pass, is no default, no hard-coded passwords. We shouldn't be saying this 20 years into connected devices, but we are.
Why? What took so long?
Well, your second point about regulation and incentives, because there's not a lot of incentive not to do it right now. You know, that if you look, it's an economic externality. The device was manufactured in far-off land, sold through intermediaries to someone maybe in the U.S., was misused by someone maybe in Europe to attack a U.S. company, but it was attacked from a device that was owned by me or someone in my house, and we never knew it was being used as an attack. And even if I did know, it still worked fine. So why did I care? I mean, how do you break into that chain to get some change to happen?
It's quite a scenario. Hillary, from your point of view, from Toyota's point of view, what do you think are the big risks for IoT?
Well, obviously, looking at this from sort of an automotive perspective, I think, and I believe I fortunately missed it, but I believe Congresswoman Eshoo made some comment about a sort of car zombie apocalypse, which is sort of I think all of our worst case scenarios, right? So I mean, I think there's obviously legitimate security and privacy concerns around sort of connected and automated vehicles, but I don't think this is all just sort of a bad news story, right? So I think. And to Jeff's point, I mean, I do think in the automotive space, the sensitivity around cybersecurity and the risks associated with the technologies that we're bringing to the market is prevalent. I think that there is a heightened awareness, different than the scenario that Jeff just explained. There are really significant risks to individual companies in the automotive space if we were to put a vehicle out on the market that was hacked. I mean, a brand reputation. It's not as sort of as distributed, as maybe Jeff was talking about. So the good news is I think there's a tremendous amount of work that's being done, a lot of awareness around this. I don't think anyone in the auto industry has their head in the sand about the risks here, and we're sort of embracing the challenges in front of us, as we embark into the future.
Chris, I'll let you weigh in.
Sure. So I'd say three different things. From a network service provider's perspective, the big issue that we're concerned about is what I would call the weaponization of IoT. So this is the concept of what happened with Mirai, where you can have low-cost, cheap commodity devices that have very little security on them that get taken over, and what they can do is they can leverage the entire broadband connection into someone's home. So if you think about the proliferation of devices combined with the increase in broadband speeds into people's homes, those two factors means we can start seeing distributed denial of service attacks that are of a scale we wouldn't have imagined 5 years ago. And I don't have charts in front of me, but there is data that shows that if you followed security in 2012, we started to see kind of large-scale DDoS attacks on the U.S. banks. Since then, now in 2017, the size of the DDoS attacks we're seeing today dwarf those attacks.
What was there something special about 2012?
Well, that's when we really started to see the uptick of the DDoS attacks on the financial institutions.
Okay. Do we know why? Why that year? Why wasn't it 2011, 13?
You want to get into the detail?
Public reporting.
There's public reporting on the. I guess there was it the Syrians or the Iranians?
Iranians.
The Iranians. So.
Public reporting.
Public, yes. It's been reported that they launched a lot of the attacks as a response to some of the sanctions that were imposed.
Okay. So continue.
But the size of the attacks then were much smaller than what we're seeing today. And if you look at some of the yesterday I did an event where my chief security officer spoke, and he showed a lot of graphs that kind of illustrate this. But the size of the attacks now are they're basically twice as big, 3 times as big as what we saw in 2012. So with DDoS attacks getting so big, there's always a concern that will have an effect on the overall network and on our customers. So we spend a lot of our time trying to figure out how do we prevent DDoS attacks through different technologies we can build into the network. So that's probably the top issue, because that gets right to our core business, which is providing our services, right? There's also issues, I think, the other 2 things I would say there's the issue of industrial IoT. So we have you have a lot of situations in which enterprise businesses or industries are bringing IoT devices into their environment. So like you can go and buy a camcorder or some sort of device, whatever it is, a camera for your computer or, a connected, you name it, connected device, bring it into your office, plug it into your office networking environment, and all of a sudden you've just introduced a vulnerability into your entire corporate environment. So if you can imagine that type of scenario playing out in a industrial setting for a piece of critical infrastructure, there's a big concern about IoT in the critical infrastructure space. And then I think on the consumer side, you have the obvious issues of consumer privacy and whether devices can be used to hijack the consumer's broadband connection, like I mentioned, but also used as a backdoor to get into a consumer's network and gather information and all sorts of things there. So I think there's a lot of concerns up and down the spectrum, but the number one issue for us is probably the IoT, the weaponization side.
Privacy is an interesting issue, and I was talking to Hillary about this because when I think of security, I also think about safety. And in Japan, there was a situation where you believe that probably couldn't take place in the United States because of privacy. And it was a situation that was actually supposed to help people in natural disasters. Will you share that story?
Yeah, in this horrific tsunami that happened a number of years ago in Japan, there was a situation where the government went to the automakers and asked them to turn on sort of vehicle tracking capability so they could figure out where people were making turns, U-turns on the road, which would give some indication of where there might have been some blockages or an inability to sort of get through a space. And so using that data, the government was then able to go in and sort of clear where people maybe were cut off from the rest of the country. And I do think, it's a really interesting example of where some of this connected technology was used to promote sort of a response to a natural disaster. And I'm fairly certain that something like that wouldn't be possible in the United States because of such legitimate concerns around privacy and consumers' privacy.
It's just interesting when privacy can cut both ways.
Right, exactly.
Chris, you were on one of these panels, and you said something so interesting. It was back in May. You said attackers go to where the users are.
Yes.
So where are the users, and how are the attackers finding them?
Well, people are buying these devices, right? So
It's just straight up devices.
Well, not just the devices, but the concern is that there's these low-cost commodity devices. If you look at Mirai, a lot of those devices were manufactured overseas. I was saying yesterday that if you actually look at like the webcams that were getting affected, or some of these cameras, they are I guess DVRs, that type of equipment. They were literally manufactured in Chinese. The user manuals were written in Chinese, so they were clearly built overseas. And I think the big issue that we're worried about right now is that there could be intentional backdoors being placed in these devices where they're being distributed out, and effectively they're just kind of lying in wait. Where if an attacker, let's say it's a nation state or someone else, can then turn those on and weaponize them and turn them into a large attack vector. But that is the big issue that we're concerned about, and I think that's what the U.S. government's concerned about. In the executive order that President Trump issued earlier in the year, they talked about botnets and DDoS attacks and trying to take action on that. We just finished a report at the National Security Telecommunications Advisory Council that's going to be finalized next week that talks about different things that the ecosystem can do on botnets. So there's a lot of concern around dealing with these kind of robots and how do we stop that environment.
Jeff, I know your company's had some success taking down the bad guys. I know it sounds so cowboy. But tell us a little bit about that, and just I want to hear more about that.
Some work on botnets, some work on ransomware criminal frauds, and that is work in conjunction with FBI, governments around the world. We partner with law enforcement around the globe. The most, picking one out, I guess it was a year or so ago, this was an 8-year process working with law enforcement identifying a criminal gang based in Eastern Europe. We tracked them as they moved from eBay scams to ransomware to bank hijacking software, Zeus botnet. Working with Eastern European authorities, arrested 3 guys over there, extradited to the US. That is a long process. And you can look at that in one of 2 ways. Some of the feedback as well. There's 3 people out of however many, but there is a deterrence factor to doing that. And that flips into what I think the US government is doing with indictments last year. It was last year against the Chinese, the PLA, and also against some Iranian individuals. On the one hand, they're not going to be extradited to the US. On the other hand, we've just limited their travel options. And if you are a low-level officer in a foreign military working on their cyber operations and your face appears on an FBI Most Wanted poster, the guy in the cubicle next to you is not going to be thrilled about doing that very much. So there is an element of deterrence there, but still not enough. Companies like mine, AT&T, we all work with the US government, with other governments, within proper privacy constraints, but it is an essential element of combating the bigger problem here. We also, on the WannaCry outbreak this spring, That broke on Friday morning, Mother's Day weekend. It was a long weekend on the phone, sharing telemetry with DHS, with the White House, with others, anticipating where that was going. And that was probably the best public-private partnership I've seen in the 7-8 years I've been doing that. It was a good give and take. Usually you give up to the government information and they nod and say thank you, and then you never hear from them. In this case, we were getting information back and doing joint analyses. So that was a really good opportunity on the fly. It was a part of why the U.S. wasn't impacted. I think good luck was a bigger part of it with WannaCry, but it was a part of it.
In describing that was very dramatic. What are the challenges for you and for, I guess, all of us to be able to have that happen more often? I mean, you said it was an 8-year process. It took so long. What are the challenges? Why does it take so long? Why is it so hard?
So if you're looking to prosecute someone, that's a lengthier process, evidentiary rules, working with the government. If you just want to work together, whether it's on the DDoS effort that Chris talked about, on WannaCry, I think it is muscle memory that we're now getting. That process worked in WannaCry because that afternoon I emailed 2 folks I knew in government who I'd worked with, said, hey, you guys want any input? And I figured they were overwhelmed, and to my great surprise, I got a response within minutes. 15 minutes later, we had a connection.
That's so interesting.
That was a
phone call.
Yeah, I almost, my weekend would have been better if they'd never replied. But that worked well on the fly. Now, if they were looking, I'm a lawyer, but I used to be one. How could you have used that to prosecute if they were to find the originators of WannaCry? I don't know, but the response part, I think, is easier to do quickly than the long-term prosecution part. And we are involved in other efforts that have been ongoing for a long time because it is making a case takes a lot of work, and you have to be very meticulous about it.
If I could just offer one comment.
Yeah, of course. Please jump in.
When we did the Instack report, we were briefed by CSIPs and the FBI and others, and one of the things that came out was that the incentives for prosecutors are not necessarily aligned with botnet takedowns. So what we saw in the discussion was that takedowns actually are somewhat effective, and I mean, the attackers migrate to the next thing, right? But at least temporarily, you can disrupt what they're doing. And so what we found is that most of the prosecutors are incented to prosecute, right? They're not incented to just initiate an activity and take down a botnet if they can't prosecute. And since a lot of the actors are based overseas, in particular countries haven't signed on to things like the Budapest Convention, so they aren't capable of being extradited and prosecuted, there's not a lot of an incentive for a prosecutor to spend a lot of time and build a case, as Jeff's talking about, and actually do something just for the sake of disrupting a botnet. So one of the recommendations we're making in that report is that there ought to be a realignment or reconsideration of those incentives so that prosecutors in the Justice Department actually there's more consistency in the approach, and they're incented to actually take more activity to disrupt, not just prosecute.
So if I could piggyback on this, I do think this is a fascinating conversation because one of the things that I do think where there is an opportunity in my sector, in the auto sector, is finding ways for sort of more collaboration and coordination with the government on these matters. I think that this is uncharted territory for a lot of folks in the auto industry, and going into a space where traditionally our relationship with the U.S. government has been one of regulator and regulatee, right, and not necessarily one of coordination and collaboration and figuring out how our industry can sort of find its way into more collaborative relationship on some of these cybersecurity or security privacy related issues, I think is one that's a challenge for us and a challenge also for those in the U.S. government who are used to, treating us as a regulated entity. And, so anyway,
why is that a challenge for you?
It's a challenge because so we're and I think this is not just for the auto industry. This is for any sort of heavily regulated industry, whether we're talking about medical devices and the relationship with the FDA. There are parts of the U.S. government that are open, that where we could foster sort of these collaborative and relationships. There are other parts of the government, those that regulate us, where that hasn't necessarily always been the case, right? And trying to figure out how to focus on these agencies where collaboration and coordination are sort of part of their mission, and less on sort of the regulatee relationship.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. I'm going to lighten this up just for a minute here because the gloom and doom is bumming me out.
Right.
There was this great article called "The Internet of Things Has Turned on Me Big Time." Dear diary, I'm writing by the light of a candle with a pencil in the bathroom. I have to sit here in the dark. You see, the Internet of Things is driving me mad out of my mind. The appliances in my home are ruining me, sliming me. They bully me. The washing machine emailed me. I know what you and the boys did last night. Spaghetti and Chianti again. The television in the bedroom tweeted, you're cut off. No more binge watching Married with Children. I tried to reach out to the appliances to make peace with them. I've pleaded with the smart meter in the kitchen. Can't we just get along? After all, we all live in the same house. So this is obviously a funny way of talking about taking humans out of the equation. And I'm interested in what you think is the effect of taking humans out of the equation on security. Given you just said a phone call helped lead to a takedown.
I think we don't know is the problem, because you have connected devices that are, based on their design, are making connections with other devices that were never envisioned by either manufacturer. And that's go back several years to an earlier NSTAC report on, I think we were calling it the industrial internet, then Internet of Things. One of the things that we put in that report was concern that you're going to have a web of connections leading and decision trees, overlapping decision trees within these devices, doing things that you don't know about. So the answer is I don't know. But it also leads to, your article had me thinking about one of the points I often make when I talk about this is that just because you can connect something doesn't mean you should connect it. And just because you buy a connected device doesn't mean it has to be connected. My wife bought a car that you could start remotely, and I asked her, are you ever going to do this? And she said no. So we shut it off, because if she was never going to do it, I wanted to make sure that no one else was going to do it. If you can buy a not connected toaster, that's the one you should buy unless you have a specific need for the, turn the toaster on from the road.
I'm curious for you, Hillary, because humans are the ones driving cars.
Yeah, no, but just to draw on that, I mean, I think in the auto space, we need to differentiate, I think, very much between those features that are being offered for sort of convenience purposes, the remote start of your car, versus what I think is motivating a lot of us, which is the safety. Way too many people die in car crashes in this country and around the world every year. And there's something that we can do about that. And that is going to require automation and connectivity. And so, the trade-offs, I think, are quite different when you're talking about remote starting your vehicle versus preventing tens of thousands of people from dying on the roads each year, right? So, but to your question about, the whole point of what we do as an industry is to move people from one point to another point. So the person remains sort of central to the equation. I don't see that changing at any point.
That is such an important point, though, and I say this as the security vendor. We cannot get so obsessed with security that it prevents us from deploying technologies that are going to either prevent accidents or in healthcare devices that are going to save a lot of lives because of a hypothetical. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do security, but there is always a trade-off, and I don't want us to swing too far to that security pendulum where we're not even thinking about the benefits that we're getting to society.
All right, let's see, do we have questions from the audience? No, yes? How did you feel about the human question, Chris? We didn't let you get in there.
Well, I think when it comes to security itself, there's obviously a movement towards automated security, but right now there is definitely still a human component in that. I mean, whenever we talk about doing things on the network on security, there's still people out there that have to validate and authenticate what we're going to do. We wouldn't just do something that we didn't have any kind of human involvement in at this point. The interesting thing will be when AI gets developed and whether that can take over the role what a human can do and whether security can become fully automated. There's clearly a desire to go to automation and machine learning so that we can do things a lot quicker in the security space, but I think that's going to take some time to evolve. But as it stands right now, the phone call, we got the similar phone calls when WannaCry happened, so I think that's still a lot of what happens right now. But over time, it's going to continue to evolve.
Before we wrap up, I want to let each of you take an opportunity if there's something that we haven't covered that you think is important about this issue. What do you think, Jeff?
Yeah, I think the most important point I think people should take away is that this is not hopeless. You are not helpless. There are things you can do to secure your devices, to secure your accounts, to secure your digital identity. And when I hear the cascading stories about horrible things happening, I worry that people are just going to say, hell with it, I'm done. I can't do anything. And that's what the criminals are counting on. There is a lot one can do to make oneself very secure. So don't get discouraged.
How about for you, Hillary?
Yeah, earlier I mentioned that there's a lot being done in the auto industry. Maybe just to get into some of the specifics quickly. So in advance of there ever having been a real world attack, sort of non-security research type attack on a vehicle, the auto industry came together and we decided to form an auto ISAC, an information sharing entity, so that we could start to share threats and vulnerability information amongst ourselves. We're very proud of being proactive in doing that. And that ISAC now is in the process of developing automotive cybersecurity best practices that each of us can use to sort of benchmark against and work to sort of advance the state of the art within our own company. And all of this is being done, to my earlier point, as an attempt to sort of get ahead of this, to be proactive in this, to not wait until something horrible happens in the real world to then try to move the ball forward.
And Chris, I'll give you the last word.
So I think if you think about IoT security, I think we're at a critical inflection point for IoT. So if you look at what happened with under President Obama when he issued the executive order that led to the NIST cybersecurity framework, that was around 2013, there was a lot of concern about enterprise security. I think we're at a very similar inflection point in IoT, that something needs to be done, and there needs to be a greater sense of urgency to do something to deal with these devices that are out there. And so that doesn't mean that we need to have government step in and regulate right now. But I think that the industry, there is pressure on industry to step up and actually build in some level of security in the devices. And so that's one of the things that we talk about in the Instack report, that each part of the ecosystem, whether it's the device makers, whether it's the network service providers, whether it's the application developers, there needs to be better security best practices built in up and down the ecosystem so that we can deal with some of these things. And I think that's something that we're all acknowledging. There's a lot of discussion about how to move that forward. So short of regulation, I think the industry has to step up and deal with some of these issues. I think they are moving in that direction. Clearly, the automakers are, but it's going to be an ongoing. Security is not an end state. You don't become secure. It's just a constant due diligence and management issue. But we have to continually evolve and be updating those standards. And the last thing I'll say is that the ecosystem, it includes everyone has a role to play. Consumers have a role to play, but we also can't rely entirely on the consumers. I mean, maybe I'm a skeptic, but I think people, if you give somebody the option to plug something in, they will just because they can. And so at the end of the day, people are going to buy these devices because they can. And so we're not going to stop the flood of devices being out there. And so, and the idea that we can get all the consumers, fully educated to protect themselves, we've been trying that for a long time. It's super complicated and difficult to do. So while consumers have a role to play and there's tips and advice you can give them on how to be secure, at the end of the day, the industry also has to provide solutions that can help deal with the issue, completely abstract from the user.
Well, this is to be continued, but not right now. Thank you so much. Thanks to our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, Steve, and Jillian, and all of our speakers for a fascinating conversation today. And I'd like to thank our underwriter, Visa, for making today possible, and thank you all for being here today. Your time is valuable, and we appreciate you spending it with us. And one last request before you go. You'll get an email from me with a survey. There are some hard copies in the room as well. If you could take the time to fill it out, your opinions are very important to us. And everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you.